Something is happening in the Caribbean Sea that the media isn't telling you the full story about. Right now, the United States is assembling its largest military force in the Western Hemisphere since the 1989 invasion of Panama. But the official reason? Counter-narcotics. Does that make sense to you? In the next 15 minutes, I will show you why that official story is a smokescreen. We are going to uncover the secret war America is waging against Venezuela. A war involving a $50 million bounty, a mysterious drug cartel allegedly run by the president himself, and the looming threat of a conflict that could destabilize the entire region. And what I'm about to reveal in the final 5 minutes about the involvement of Russia and Iran will change everything you thought you knew about this crisis. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a story pieced together from declassified intelligence reports, historical patterns, and the very words of the officials involved. By the end of this video, you won't just know what is happening. You will understand why. You will understand the failed policies, the hidden motives, and the terrifying human cost of a geopolitical chess game that has been playing out for decades. Right on America's doorstep, for decades, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela has been a story of oil, ideology, and mistrust. But how did we get here? How did a country that should be a global energy superpower, with larger proven oil reserves than even Saudi Arabia, become a failed state on the verge of war? The answer isn't simple, and it begins long before Nicolas Maduro. It begins with a promise, the promise of unimaginable wealth, buried deep beneath the earth. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the shining star of Latin America. Thanks to its oil, it had the highest GDP per capita on the continent. American energy giants like Exxon and Chevron flocked to the country, forming joint ventures with the state-owned oil company, PDVSA. It was a golden era. A dense network of refineries was built along the US Gulf Coast, specifically designed to process Venezuela's heavy crude. By the late 90s, Venezuela was the single largest supplier of oil to the United States. The two nations were inextricably linked by a river of black gold. But where there is great wealth, there is often great corruption. It's estimated that between 1972 and 1997, a staggering $100 billion was embezzled by corrupt government officials. The nation became dangerously overdependent on oil, which accounted for 90% of its exports and 40% of its entire GDP. This created a house of cards. And in the 1980s, when global oil prices crashed, that house began to fall. Inflation soared, debt became unsustainable, and the government, backed by the IMF, imposed brutal austerity measures on its own people. The same people who had watched billions of dollars vanish into the pockets of the elite were now told to tighten their belts. The result was predictable: fury. Deadly riots erupted across the country. The people's trust was broken. It was into this firestorm of public anger that a revolutionary figure named Hugo Chavez emerged. After a failed coup attempt in 1992 landed him in prison, he rode a wave of anti-government sentiment to victory in the 1998 presidential election. He ran on a simple, powerful promise: to redistribute the nation's oil wealth and lift the people out of poverty. Thus began the socialist experiment in Venezuela. At first, Chavez's policies seemed to work. Poverty rates fell, but beneath the surface, he was setting in motion the very events that would lead to the nation's catastrophic collapse. In 2002, when workers at the state-owned oil company PDVSA went on strike, Chavez didn't negotiate. He fired thousands of the most experienced engineers and technicians in the industry, gutting the country of its technical expertise overnight. He then seized the assets of foreign oil companies like Exxon and Chevron, effectively nationalizing the entire industry. This move shattered Venezuela's relationship with the United States and scared off foreign investment, which was critical for maintaining the country's complex refineries. At the same time, he began shipping heavily subsidized oil to allies like Cuba and Nicaragua, further draining the nation's strategic reserves. His system was unsustainable, but it was popular. It allowed him to consolidate power, eliminate presidential term limits, and silence independent media. He became a near dictator. When Chavez died in 2013, his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, took over. Maduro inherited a system already teetering on the brink. And just 1 year later, the final domino fell. In 2014, the global price of oil collapsed again, plummeting from over $100 a barrel to less than 30. The Chavez-era social programs, funded entirely by high oil prices, were no longer affordable. The money was gone. Protests and riots once again engulfed the nation. But unlike Chavez, Maduro had little popular support. He responded not with reform, but with violence and brutal crackdowns. This is when the United States, under the Obama administration, first declared Venezuela a national security threat and imposed targeted sanctions. But the real avalanche, the policy that would shatter the relationship beyond repair, would come with the Trump administration. The turning point was the 2018 Venezuelan presidential election. Maduro claimed victory in an election that was widely condemned as fraudulent. Major opposition candidates were banned, turnout was at rock bottom, and accusations of fraud were rampant. The United States, along with the EU and most of Latin America, refused to recognize the results. Instead, they recognized the head of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate interim president. Diplomatic ties were severed, but it didn't stop there. The Trump administration unleashed a policy of maximum pressure, a torrent of economic sanctions designed to strangle the Maduro regime and force him from power. Venezuela's access to the US financial system was cut off. American companies were banned from buying Venezuelan oil, and secondary sanctions targeted any company involved in transporting it. This was a death blow. Venezuela lost access to the specialized US refineries it had relied on for decades. It was blocked from importing spare parts and chemicals needed to maintain its own crumbling infrastructure. The result was a collapse of almost unbelievable proportions. Coupled with decades of corruption and mismanagement, the sanctions caused Venezuela's oil production to fall off a cliff. Today, despite sitting on the world's largest reserves, Venezuela produces less oil than it did during World War II. Between 2014 and 2021, the Venezuelan economy shrank by an almost inconceivable 75%. One of the worst economic collapses in modern history. Hyperinflation soared to 130,000%. The currency became worthless. Basic goods, food, water, gasoline became scarce luxuries. By 2022, more than half of the population was living in poverty. This devastation was, in large part, by design. The goal was to destroy Maduro's popularity and inspire an internal uprising to remove him, but it backfired spectacularly. The sanctions directly fueled the very migration crisis at the US southern border that would become a central political issue in America. Since 2014, nearly 8 million refugees have fled Venezuela. By 2023, the number of undocumented Venezuelan migrants in the US had skyrocketed by nearly tenfold since the heavy sanctions were imposed. Even worse, the primary goal of the sanctions failed. Maduro did not fall. He clung to power, using the sanctions as a propaganda tool to blame the US for his country's suffering. He crushed protests and, isolated from the West, pivoted hard towards America's greatest adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran. Cuba provided intelligence support. Russia and Iran supplied arms to replace American weapons. China bought up what little oil Venezuela had left to sell. Geopolitically, Venezuela became a second Cuba, a hostile base of operations for US rivals in the Western Hemisphere. It was during this time that the Trump administration first labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist, placing a $15 million bounty on his head. The US government accused Maduro and his inner circle of running a drug cartel, known as the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles, using the state apparatus to traffic cocaine into the United States. They were accused of collaborating with FARC rebels in Colombia, a designated terrorist organization. Suddenly, Maduro wasn't just an illegitimate dictator. He was a wanted fugitive.
Move them here.
When the Biden administration took over, it tried a different approach.
Sure about this?
After Russia invaded Ukraine, Biden sought to ease the pressure on Venezuela, hoping to get more oil onto the global market to lower prices and hurt Russia's war effort. He allowed Chevron to restart some operations and eased sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold a free and fair presidential election in 2024. It was a policy of engagement, an attempt to achieve through diplomacy what maximum pressure could not. But Maduro had other plans. Almost immediately after agreeing to the deal, Maduro manufactured a new crisis. He held a national referendum to claim nearly 70% of neighboring Guyana's territory, a long-disputed region that happens to contain massive, newly discovered offshore oil reserves, operated by the American company ExxonMobil. This move served two purposes. First, it was a nationalistic distraction. Second, and more importantly, Maduro used the referendum as a pretext to crush his political opponents, accusing them of treason for attempting to sabotage it. He issued arrest warrants for his most capable rivals, clearing the field for the 2024 election. The Biden administration, feeling betrayed, reimposed sanctions. The 2024 election was a repeat of 2018, but even more blatant. Both Maduro and his main opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, claimed victory. But Maduro refused to release any official vote tallies. The opposition, however, produced tally sheets from a majority of polling centers, showing a landslide victory for Gonzalez. The US, Europe, and most of the Western Hemisphere refused to recognize Maduro's claim, and instead recognized Gonzalez as the legitimate president-elect. Once again, Russia, China, and Iran backed Maduro. Protests erupted, and Maduro's forces cracked down violently, arresting thousands and killing dozens. An arrest warrant was issued for Gonzalez, who fled into exile in Spain. Maduro had become a full-blown dictator, who no longer cared about even the pretense of democracy. Trump's economic warfare had failed. Biden's diplomacy had failed. Maduro remained more entrenched than ever, while American influence was replaced by that of its enemies. This is the context for Trump's return to the presidency in his second term, and the dramatic shift in strategy we are witnessing today. The second Trump administration inherited a failed policy. Another 4 years of the same sanctions seemed pointless. Further diplomacy was seen as weak, and was deeply unpopular with his voter base, especially in South Florida, and with his own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a longtime hawk on Venezuela. Trump likely calculated that a new tactic was needed, something short of a full-blown war, but more forceful than anything tried before. The result is the strategy we see now, a modern form of gunboat diplomacy. He signed a secret directive authorizing the US military to attack cartels designated as terrorist organizations. He then designated the Cartel of the Suns as one of those organizations, providing a legal framework to target not just criminals, but the Venezuelan state itself, which he claims is indistinguishable from a cartel. Then came the money. The bounty on Maduro was increased from $25 million to an unprecedented $50 million, the largest bounty the US government has ever placed on a single individual in history. To put that in perspective, it's double the bounty that was ever on Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein. It's the combined bounty of both men. Tens of millions more were placed on the heads of his inner circle, totaling $100 million for just 4 senior leaders. And then came the warships. 3 modern guided missile destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, at least 1 nuclear-powered attack submarine, and the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, essentially a miniature aircraft carrier, filled with thousands of US Marines, Harrier jets, and assault helicopters. All of this firepower gathered just off Venezuela's coast. And on September 2nd, the first shots were fired. A boat in international waters was destroyed by a missile, likely from an American MQ-9 Reaper drone, killing all 11 people on board. The US claimed they were members of the Tren de Aragua cartel, carrying drugs. This was not a Coast Guard interception. It was a lethal military strike, a tactic never before used against drug runners in this region. The message was clear. The rules have changed. Maduro is panicking. He has ordered a full mobilization of his military, called for millions of citizens to join armed militias, and deployed 15,000 troops to the border, vowing to fight to the bitter end. Venezuelan fighter jets have flown close to the American warships, and the US has warned they will be shot down if they do it again. We have never been closer to the brink of war, but what does Trump actually want? The forces deployed are not enough for a full-scale invasion and occupation of a country the size of Venezuela. That would require tens of thousands of troops, but that's likely not the goal. The strategy here appears to be far more subtle, and perhaps more dangerous. Trump is likely betting that after the stolen 2024 election, Maduro is deeply unpopular and vulnerable from within. The massive bounties, combined with the intimidating presence of US warships just offshore, might be enough to tempt someone inside Venezuela, a rival general, a disillusioned faction to launch a rebellion, a coup. The expectation would be that if a rebellion begins, the US would provide critical air support and intelligence, giving the rebels the edge they need to topple the regime. This mirrors the NATO strategy in Libya in 2011, where air power enabled rebels on the ground to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi without committing Western ground troops. The US even has a leader in waiting, Edmundo Gonzalez, whom it already recognizes as the legitimate president.